Hey everyone, I am John Cartwright, and I am joined by Derek Bittner.
Hi.
Daniel Alba.
Hello.
Today, we're gonna probably ruffle a few feathers, not intentionally. We're gonna talk about the 6th generation of consoles. The PlayStation 2, the GameCube, and also a bit of Xbox if that comes up. But there's a lot of discussion and favoritism right now towards the GameCube, I've noticed. A lot of people who grew up in that era have now come back to the GameCube in a very positive light. And PlayStation 2, which sold over 150 million units, probably doesn't get the same discussion these days. And so I kind of want to talk about which console we kind of grew up with in that time, which one's our favorite now, and just our memories and our positive experiences with all of these systems. So, Daniel, were you a GameCube guy or a PS2 guy in that time?
I was definitely a GameCube guy. I got the console very close to its launch, right the Christmas that was right after its release, and a lot of people, I imagine, must have had the same situation because I remember getting with a lot of friends that got Smash Brothers Melee, which was the one I was looking forward to. It wasn't actually a launch title. Some people think it was, but it actually was not a launch title for the console. Then the PS2, for me, I ended up getting that. It was a few years into that cycle that I got into it. But the first game I got was Kingdom Hearts.
Nice.
I still remember. I was asking for it for my birthday, and my mom was like, "Are you sure you want this game? It has like Goofy and Aladdin in it." And I was like, "Yes, mom." That's what I want to get. That was
Oh no, my son's regressing.
Oh no, he's going back to Disney. Yeah, those were my first two experiences, but I definitely have more games and memories with the GameCube than I do with the PlayStation 2.
Oh, I think that perspective's going to be probably different to mine and Derek's, but Derek, what was your experience with these systems?
I actually got both systems at launch. So I got the PS2 when it first launched just because I was a huge PS1 fan, and I picked it up right away, though I do distinctly remember not having a lot to play. The launch of the PS2, like the amount of games available was pretty bare, to the point that I actually picked up SSX, and I enjoyed that game a lot, but it's also like I would never normally play a snowboarding game, so I was just looking for things to play. Honestly, I convinced my family because it's like, it's a DVD player too. We have a DVD player now. It's a huge thing, and that's how a lot of people, that's a big reason PS2 sold so well. But GameCube is still a big thing for me because it was my return to Nintendo consoles. I've been sticking with the handhelds, but after the NES, I didn't get any of the future systems. Sonic lured me away to the Genesis, and then my family was like, "Oh, he likes the Genesis. We'll go with the Sega Saturn." And it's like, no, the Sega Saturn did not. Unless you know what's going on, you do not want to go for the Saturn. And then by that point, when I was like, can I please have something else other than the Saturn? My family was looking. It's like, okay, it looks like PlayStation is doing very well, so let's get you the PlayStation. So that I just sort of stuck with that. But seeing my friends with their N64, seeing Melee coming out, I was like, I want a GameCube. That looks fun. So it was Smash that lured me to the GameCube.
Nice. So I kind of went back to GameCube in the Wii era. I had a group of friends during the PlayStation 2 period where I was the PS2 guy, another friend was the GameCube guy, and another guy was the Xbox guy.
Oh.
So I kind of got to experience them
nice.
all through my friends. The GameCube friend didn't really let me play games. I just kind of watched him play games.
Oh.
So I got to watch Zelda, I got to watch him play Smash, a multiplayer game, I got to watch him play Mario. So a lot of these were in my mind that I wanted to play them myself, but I didn't really get to do it until the Wii. So when Wii came along, I just went to a used game store and just bought loads of GameCube games. And that was before the price really started to rise.
That was smart in retrospect.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So I didn't really get any of the lulls of the GameCube era. I just kind of got to play them all in one big burst. But during the actual time, though, I was definitely PS2. And I got around 2002, I think. So I didn't have the launch title woes. But Derek, you're really right about PS2's launch. There wasn't a whole lot there. Like, Time Splitters was a launch title, which is great. But other than that, there's no Ratchet and Clank, there's no Sly, there's no Jack. It wasn't really until the holiday of that year that PS2 really took off. And we're talking like Devil May Cry, Grand Theft Auto, Eco, Jak and Daxter. It was an incredible holiday. But yeah, for that first year, it was a little bit lacking.
Yeah, it's fitting though that PlayStation like had all these amazing games by the time GameCube and Xbox launched. They were like, as you were saying for that holiday, it's like just massive, huge hits available on the PS2. And how do you compete with that on Xbox and GameCube? I mean, Xbox had Halo right out of the gate, and that was a phenomenon. But that sort of remained to be really Xbox's only big hitter was the Halo games, because they did fine for otherwise, and their multi-platform tended to be the best looking visually if you wanted that thing, but it just tended to not really be talked about a whole lot. And GameCube, well, had to wait for Smash. Otherwise, their launch game, they had great launch games in retrospect: Luigi's Mansion, Wave Race, Monkey Ball, and Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2.
Right.
And that still looks gorgeous today. It has a solid lineup, but I don't think anything on the caliber that can really compete with Final Fantasy X and Grand Theft Auto 3 and Devil May Cry, with it just these genre breakers or the definers that really appealed to everyone.
And that's kind of the thing. Nintendo carried the GameCube very, very much themselves. Like, there were a few third parties, absolutely there were. But PlayStation 2's third-party support was immense. And I'm not just talking multi-platform stuff. A lot of third parties exclusively made games for GameCube. Konami in particular. Like, Metal Gear Solid 2 did come to Xbox.
You said GameCube, but it's PS2, I believe you're talking about.
Oh, right, yeah. Yeah, my bad. Yeah, but when it came to, like, Konami games, we had Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty, Substance came to Xbox. Silent Hill 2, that also came to Xbox, but Silent Hill 3 didn't. Metal Gear Solid 3 didn't. Stuff like Final Fantasy was exclusive to PS2. Dragon Quest, exclusive to PS2. There were so many big third-party games that developers only focus on PlayStation. And, you know, when you look at the sales numbers, you can tell why. You can absolutely see why. Why would you bother bringing games to, you know, the 21 million unit GameCube or the 30 million unit Xbox when there's 150 million units on PS2?
Yeah, it was night and day. Like, there was just no comparison. There's a reason Sony had such a big head going into the PlayStation 3 with such a lead over the others. Like, it was not even close. But I do think it's interesting you talking about that legacy of the GameCube, and why it seems to be talked about much more now than the PS2 is. And I've been thinking about that since you brought up the idea of doing this discussion. And I think a lot of it has to do with just most of these games are either not really covered anymore in the PS2 era. Like, Sony doesn't talk about Jak and Daxter. Ratchet and Clank is, you know, still around, thankfully, but Sly Cooper, they got a half mention as far when it was time for their anniversary. Like, Sony first party games don't really get talked about, or they're still coming out. Like, we got God of War on PS2. But now we have God of War in a very different context on PS5. It never really went away, and I don't know if people can look back at the original God of War games are still fantastic, but maybe not as in vogue as they were at the time. GameCube has this sort of timeless ability where, like, a lot of the exclusives are still exclusive to GameCube, and they've not gone to anywhere else.
Yeah, and a lot of, you know, in the time period, third parties definitely were all coming to PS2, but now a lot of those big games have gone multi-platform. Devil May Cry HD Collection is on everything. So is Metal Gear Solid 2, the Metal Gear Solid HD Collection, that's on Xbox and PlayStation. And I'm not saying everything was ported. No way. There's so many exclusives that are still on PS2. But the big ones, the huge third-party publishers, they have tended to have moved to multi-platform re-releases now.
You get a lot of cult classics that are still locked to the PS2 and haven't been re-released. But for most of the major games, yeah, they've been ported. Heck, I believe like small games like Disgaea and Atelier games are making their way to the Switch, and they're still carried on. Like, if there's a will, they can do it. Like I know I had La Pucelle Tactics on the PlayStation 2. And that is recently been ported to the Switch as part of that Prinny Presents lineup from NIS. Like, there's a lot of games from the PS2 era that have found their way to modern consoles, either through re-releases or compilations or what have you. Even the old like Mega Man Anniversary and X collections are kind of moot now because there's better ones with the Legacy collections.
Yeah, there's a strange, weird like mix of PS2 games that made their way to the 3DS for one random reason or another. Metal Gear Solid 3 was released on the 3DS. Dragon Quest 8 was also released there. Tales of the Abyss, which is one of the only Tales games on the PS2, also ported to 3DS. It's just a strange like mix of games that have been making themselves over there, but they're not. Yeah, if not for that, they would be solely exclusive on the PS2, which is I find fascinating.
With PS2, I feel like if you are a fan of any specific genre, there is something for you. Like if you want racing games, you got Ridge Racer 5. You want RPGs, you got Final Fantasy 10. You want adventure games, you've got like Jak and Daxter, Shadow of the Colossus. Like it just goes on and on and on and on and on. GameCube, I think, has some gaps. There's definitely a lot of great multiplayer games. Like you got Smash, you've got Mario Party. When it comes to like racing, though, we've got Mario Kart. What else would you kind of bring up? All
F-Zero.
RPGs. F-Zero is a great shout, yeah. But with RPGs, we've got like Paper Mario. We've got... I'm struggling to find more examples.
Bat and Kaitos, I guess, is like other big one. But
called Tales of Symphonia is on the GameCube as well.
Tales of Symphonia, exactly.
But there's only so many you can name off.
I think that
on one hand.
I think that's also why Tales of Symphonia stands out for so many people, where it was a solid game, but also lifting up a struggling genre on the GameCube.
It's the N64 problem.
It's the same.
Where like there's some amazing games on N64, but many genres and variety is just kind of left a little bit. There's not a whole lot of choice in the end.
It's interesting to see how the PS2 focused mostly on single-player experiences. Like there were some where you do 2 players, but mostly it's like your RPGs, your Grand Theft Autos, your games that pretty much just the highlight be the single player experience, whereas GameCube would have so many multiplayer experiences where you couldn't get anywhere else with 4-player just being locked right in there. You'd have to buy like a multi-tab if you want to do anything 4-player with the PS2, which was
a big deal.
A hassle in itself. But like pretty much all the main ones you can name. One of the mainstays of the GameCube, like Melee, Monkey Ball, all the Mario parties, those genres, like they thrived so much on there. And the GameCube did so many things uniquely, things that you can't do with any other console, like with Game Boy Advance attachments with games like, as we were playing Four Swords Adventures, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, and Pac-Man Versus, which was super interesting at the time.
Yeah, amazing game. Do you think GameCube is quality over quantity compared to PS2? Like, is it a better? Are the games better, even if there's fewer of them?
If you ask a lot of people who mostly played the GameCube, they will tell you that.
I think they would.
But, the quality of PS2 games is still pretty high up there. I can't discount how good some of those games are.
I think the quality of PS2 is still overall better just because there's more. Obviously, there's crap on both, but I think with so many publishers putting out these big games, you could just have that quality on PS2. And like when I try to think of GameCube games that can stand with the best of the best on PlayStation, my mind goes to Wind Waker and Metroid Prime, and then I start to struggle on what others.
And you can say Resident Evil 4.
Resident Evil 4.
PS2, but the GameCube version is
true.
The way to play. Yeah.
Original Resident Evil as well. That remake it took a while to come to other systems, and that is a fantastic remake. Set the stage.
But with PS2, I'm thinking like Shadow of the Colossus, Dragon Quest 8. They're just game after game after game, and it is all of them are such different genres as well. Like, but with GameCube, I feel like a lot there's absolutely fantastic games. F-Zero GX is one of the greatest races ever made. Thousand Year Door is such a charming RPG.
Eternal Darkness is still unique to this day as far as the horror genre. Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, probably one of the best Fire Emblem games.
Absolutely. I feel like a few of the biggest first-party games have elements of troubled development that still radiate in them, though. Like Wind Waker, the pacing of that game, I think it's a great game, but the pacing, you can feel something wasn't there, right? Like, there's a point
Right.
in the game where you've got to go and find, like, 3 things to save the Master Sword, and one of those things is just in a cutscene. It's like, clearly there's meant to be a dungeon there, but it just wasn't in there. With Mario Sunshine, I think you can feel there was a lack of polish in areas. Melee was rushed. People like it despite it being rushed, but it definitely has, there's definitely remnants of that game being rushed through the door.
Everyone knows about Sakurai's like 11-month struggle to get that game done within a year, and that's why there's such a bigger imbalance of characters in the game as compared to other Smash Brothers games. But yeah, that's, as you mentioned too, like with Wind Waker, like they've gone out of the way to correct some of the pacing with the HD re-release to try and make it more closer to what they envisioned. But that dungeon is still missing, and it's a kind of it's a weird gap. It's like it feels like it should be there, and even back then I was like, this is a little strange. I just have the things now.
I'm curious whether this nostalgia comes from people who grew up in that time, or people looking back and seeing just the quality of the releases overall. I'm not sure on that one. As somebody who grew up with them, I have plenty of GameCube games that I greatly enjoy and stand out. But I also know that, as you said, it's a multiplayer machine, and unfortunately, most of my friends were not interested in playing GameCube. They wanted to play Halo, and I think that's another reason I kind of gravitated towards PlayStation 2, because I had games I could play much more easily, or I didn't, feel like I was missing out. Like, I wanted to enjoy Crystal Chronicles. Couldn't find anybody to do that Final Fantasy with me. Couldn't find anybody to play Four Swords Adventures with. Like, it was just a once in a blue moon. I could barely convince my friends to play Smash Brothers with me.
Yeah, you keep mentioning Xbox in fleeting words. Xbox was a great system. It pushed online play in a way that neither of these other two did. I mean, PS2 had online, but it wasn't like Halo 2 level online.
No.
Halo 2 was massive, and there was also some great exclusive games like Jet Set Radio Future, Panzer Dragoon Auto. There were some good Xbox games. It just wasn't quite the same caliber as these two, though. But it's still amazing for a first shot. But yeah, PS2 did have online. Like Final Fantasy 11, an MMO was on PS2. Everybody's Golf had online on PS2. Like there were a few cool online games, whereas GameCube didn't really set on that apart from like Fantasy Star.
Yeah, I was gonna say Fantasy Star is about all you're gonna get.
Yeah. Though personally, I never played PS2 online. I always wanted to play Metal Gear Solid 3 online because that looked really cool. But I just didn't have the setup to put an Ethernet cable in my PS2.
Yeah, I got the PS2 like online back the adapter at the time, and thought like, hey, it's cool, I can play online with this thing, not realizing I needed Ethernet, and I was still very much dial up. So I have this copy of Twisted Metal Black online that I cannot play.
When it comes to like the pacing of releases too, like it's very easy to look back at these libraries and be like, yeah, they were great, but in the time, there were definitely lulls. I think PS2 pretty much always had a good flow apart from its, launch till holiday. GameCube though, there were definitely spots where, as Joe was kind of saying earlier, there was sort of not much to play. Wii U had a very similar problem. It launched with a pretty great lineup of there was Melee, there was Pikmin within the sort of launch window, but after a while there's nothing really until Eternal Darkness, and then from there on, unless that you wanted to really dive in and find some of the more niche titles, you were kind of waiting for the next big Nintendo release.
Yeah, I'm looking through here, and it's like Nintendo themselves definitely were spread out quite a bit. We had the, big launch where we got Luigi's Mansion, Wave Race, Smash Brothers, Pikmin. That was all holiday 2001. Pretty good stuff. But Nintendo themselves did not put out another game until June.
Yeah, that's a huge amount of time.
That's a long time.
Yeah, with Eternal Darkness. And I'm looking what came before that point. There is maybe, looking at this list I'm seeing on Wikipedia, there were 4 games released in May of 2002 on the GameCube. Zoo Cube, Virtua Striker 2002, Legends of Wrestling, and Lost Kingdoms.
Yeah.
That's it. That was, ooh. I mean, that's not to say there weren't good stuff to try. We had a Bloody Roar game. There was Sega Soccer Slam, which is sort of like the precursor to Mario Strikers.
Yeah.
Pac-Man World 2, the original Spider-Man game, original Burnout, and even the Resident Evil remake came out in April of 2002. Like, there were good games.
There was stuff to play, yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
but it was just it wasn't like what we're seeing now, where it's just like, oh god, there's a game every week that we need that we need to play, or that's worth playing. It's like, oh, what do we do?
GameCube's third party is really interesting because like it did get some of the multiplats. It got Rayman 3. It got the Simpsons games like Hit and Run and Road Rage. It got Splinter Cell. It got Prince of Persia. Like, it definitely got some of the big multiplats. Time Splitters as well was a big one. But there was also like a lot of third-party developers sort of just specifically focused on PS2. But then a few of them specifically focused on GameCube. They had the Capcom deal, which got them like Beautiful Joe and Resident Evil, and a bunch of those did come to PS2 eventually. But there's also some like really interesting ones like Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes. You know, a ground-up remake of Metal Gear Solid 1 exclusively for GameCube, which is kind of nuts, and that game's never been ported anywhere. It's just this really interesting to look back on like what third parties actually did support GameCube and how they did it.
It's still amazing how that deal came about. I don't quite understand it myself still, but I remember at the time it was a big deal because very few third-party games are coming to the GameCube. But then you hear about the Capcom 5, and that was, I believe, it was Beautiful Joe, Piano 3, Resident Evil 4, Killer 7, and there's one more. I'm missing the fifth one, but
It's escaped my mind too.
Yeah.
It's funny how like Piano 3 is the only one that didn't leave the GameCube in the end.
Yeah, it was also probably the least successful one. maybe it did better than Killer 7, but it's funny because the elements of that game eventually would end up in Bayonetta, because it was a Shinji Megami game, so he just took some ideas from there and just transferred it to Bayonetta. So even that has its origins that kind of spread out, and hey, it's back on Nintendo thanks to Bayonetta.
Yeah, I also think it's really cool how GameCube had a Game Boy player, which was like an evolution of the Super Game Boy, where you can play Game Boy Advance games, and it could just sit permanently on the bottom of your GameCube, and like Game Boy Advance was still really alive. Like this was it wasn't dying. They just released this method to play Game Boy games on your GameCube on your TV. That was fantastic.
Actually, you could play any Game Boy title, Game Boy Color,
Yeah.
Game Boy Advance. That expanded. That's how I got into a lot of Game Boy games at the time. You just needed this little disc right here to play it.
Yeah.
If you don't have the disc, you can't play it. But I also appreciate that the Game Boy player made it into a perfect little cube. It's not actually a cube. It's a lie.
Right.
GameCube's not a cube. When you have that on there, then it becomes a true cube. But that's just so many interesting ideas that the GameCube has done that you don't see in other consoles during that time that let you play more than what was originally allowed previously. And I would play so many Game Boy Advance games just on the TV. It was so cool to have that and not have to deal with my backlight that doesn't exist on my Game Boy Advance.
It was
Yeah.
a great hardware design as a whole. Like a lot of consoles went for the sort of long and flat design, like the PlayStation 1, the PS2. Sega Saturn and Dreamcast were like they're a similar sort of cube shape, but they were definitely flatter. Whereas GameCube allowed for its hardware to sort of go more vertically, which is something we're seeing sort of again with the Series X. But it's a really cool way of stuffing a lot of power into a tiny device. Because GameCube's, like, in terms of length, it's tiny.
It's a little thing.
But it is technically... it depends on the way you see it. Technically, it's more powerful than PS2. Some third-party developers could get more out of PS2, especially if they were focusing specifically on it. But I think just in terms of raw specs, GameCube does come out on top. And that would sometimes shine through in multi-platform games. Like Sonic Heroes is 30 FPS on PS2, but 60 FPS on GameCube. And as Daniel covered in Tales of Symphonia, the Japanese exclusive PS2 version is 30 FPS. And that's plagued Symphonia forever.
I'm curious, Daniel, since you played a lot of Game Boy games through your GameCube, did you take advantage of your GBA link cable in order to play with your Game Boy Advance and have a proper D-pad? Because everybody loves the GameCube controller now, but that D-pad is still awful.
God, I don't use the D-pad on that. I use the control stick. That was fine with me. I would take the control stick over using that little D-pad anyways. I don't know anyone. Does anybody actually ever use that D-pad in earnest, like playing on the Game Boy player? I wonder, because
I hope not.
There's some games like I played a lot of like Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, and that's just like 3D. It feels so natural with the control stick because you can move in any direction.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I there were some times I was curious. I just plugged in the Game Boy Advance. I was like, oh yeah, this is a pretty natural fit. But
that's how I play. Yeah, the D-pad's so much better. Just playing with an actual
Oh
Game
yeah.
Boy.
I did that with games like Fire Emblem because that was just a lot more natural to move with the D-pad than it would be like free range with a control stick. But yeah, most of the time I would use my GameCube controller for as much of a heathen as that makes me sound like.
It's fine.
On a similar side, though, GameCube had Game Boy support if you bought a Game Boy player, but PS2 had raw, out-of-the-box PlayStation backwards compatibility.
And that was huge.
Yeah, that was huge. I was Dreamcast before PS2, and so I never really owned a PlayStation apart from watching my friend play, who was the same GameCube friend who I couldn't play the games. So I actually properly got to go out and buy PlayStation games and play them on my PS2. And that was just another side of the library. I played Final Fantasy VII for the first time on my PS2. Played Crash Bandicoot on my PS2. There was so much on there. You can't understate how big of a deal that was.
I distinctly remember around the launch of PS2, a friend of mine let me borrow his copy of Mega Man Legends 2, and that's how I played it initially.
Oh, nice.
It was like I'm like playing. I have a brand new PS2, but I'm playing the PS1, so why not?
Yeah, and you can bring your memory cards over from the PS1. You can play with just the regular non-DualShock controller if you want to. It's a pure PS1 experience, just with the new machine, which is so cool.
Yeah,
that's when I really started to appreciate the novelty of backwards compatibility, and it's still something that we still struggle with today, especially in the most modern consoles like the PS5 and the Switch at times. But yeah, at the time, that's how I got into some of the more major releases, like you mentioned, Final Fantasy VII. That's how I got into that game. Final Fantasy VIII, Chrono Cross. That's how I played those through my PS2, and I very thankful that it had that available with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Both machines were region locked, unfortunately, so there were problems depending on the region you were in. A lot of PAL games are 480p, 480i even, whereas I know progressive scan was becoming more common over in the States. And GameCube had those really expensive component cables that I'm pretty sure no one owns.
No.
If you go online, they're like $200, $300, something ridiculous.
I love the fact that the Wii was backwards compatible, because all of a sudden I could pull up a GameCube game into that. It had component cables, and then I can enjoy the progressive scan in Thousand Year Door and whatnot.
Yes, like, this is 480p.
Yeah.
Wow.
PS2's component cables are so much more readily available. Like, there's third-party ones, there's first-party ones, and they're super cheap.
They're
So
everywhere.
that's nice. But yeah, over in PAL regions, even with component cables, a lot of games were not 480p for some reason. I think they sacrificed it was either 50 hertz or 60 hertz or 480p. Like, you couldn't choose between the two for a lot of these. But yeah, this was the sort of era where 480p was becoming more of a standard. And if you had those cables, then you can fully take advantage of that. I remember, like, Resident Evil 4 was like a big push for 480p. Yeah, for GameCube, it made that system like look like an Xbox. Like, there were so few games that looked like Resident Evil 4 in that time. And Metroid Prime was 60 FPS and it looked outstanding. Yeah, like those.
Yeah.
I think this era, you can look back on these games and still think that they look incredible. There's like Shadow of the Colossus, frame rate issues, absolutely, but artistically, I think it's one of the best looking games that I've played.
I mean, this was the era that gave us cell shading.
Yeah,
And that became a huge thing, and it still helps those games stand out today.
yeah. Wind Waker is timeless. Even with the HD remaster, the GameCube version looks, I think, in some ways better. Like, HD sometimes looks a bit overexposed, but GameCube just looks. I think that's never going to look bad, that game.
I think there's something with the overall bloom and lighting with the HD version that kind of takes away from the original vision of that style.
At
like
times,
that
yeah.
you can only get it with the GameCube version.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, games like that. There's such a I still think of how varied the art style and designs are for GameCube games over even the PS2. Like you have games like Wind Waker, of course, but something very realistic like Metroid Prime. But then you still have other games that are like F-Zero GX that have, you know, just such a futuristic, such a cool futuristic look, but also those pre-rendered cutscenes look so nice as well, even
Yeah.
back then at the time. Yeah, it's just everything like Monkey Ball. Even I think of Monkey Ball's art style a lot still because of how pure and clean it is. This was really an interesting era for Sega with Nintendo as
I think
well.
we're
Oh,
like,
yeah.
yeah.
This is how I played the Sonic Adventure games. I didn't have a Dreamcast, so
I was gonna say,
played through GameCube.
I think GameCube is the reason there's so many Sonic fans.
Probably.
A lot of us started there.
Like Adventure 2 Battle on there, bam. That's I think that just sold a lot of people. Just
Yeah, and Sega gave GameCube like Skies of Arcadia as well. But
Yeah.
on the flip side, they gave Xbox Crazy Taxi 3. That was sequels. There was Panzer Dragoon Orta. There was
Shenmue.
Shenmue. Yeah, Shenmue 2 went to Xbox. You're right. Yeah, for some reason they were split between giving Xbox sequels and giving GameCube ports. But they also gave GameCube like Billy Hatcher, which was like a brand new game that was exclusive. I think in America, Puyo Puyo Fever was exclusive to GameCube, but everywhere else it came to PS2 and Xbox as well.
It's kind of funny that I can't think of too many Sega exclusives on the PS2.
Can't think of many either. I'm sure there are.
The only one that I can think of offhand is Shinobi, which wasn't that great of a game. Its whole gimmick was you have a sword that constantly needs blood, so if you're not killing things, it's taking away your health. So, not great. And then it had spin-off Kunoichi, but otherwise, I cannot think of Sega exclusive PS2 games.
I mean, if you extend it to the current ownership of Sega, there were definitely Atlas games, like Persona 3, Persona 4, Shin Megami Tensei 3. But just in terms of, just raw Sega, there's not much. They did Sega Classics Collection, which was like 3D remakes of classic Sega games. So there was like a 3D remake of Columns, I think was one of them. But there's also like Space Harrier, I'm pretty sure, and Outrun. But yeah, nothing huge though.
Yeah, it's a very odd idea. I think they just sort of...
Yakuza.
Oh, Yakuza. Yeah, Yakuza got started. It wasn't huge at the time, though, because I distinctly remember GTA clone being tossed around about Yakuza when it first came out. PS2 had you covered on genres, though, so it's, maybe Sega knew they didn't have to compete as much against other stuff.
Yeah, you have your there's such a variety that we can go on talking about. Like Psychonauts was on PS2. You have that's how I played Katamari Damacy. It was the weirdest title I've ever played on PS2. It's just because like we think of the whole major tentpole titles like Grand Theft Auto and Metal Gear and such. They still have their unique weird titles as well on PS2 that some people don't always think of right away, but they still are very much like how I identify the PS2 era as well.
Yeah.
But the thing with PS2 is like you get one developer who makes one of the best games of all time, and then next year they've done it again with this like Metal Gear Solid 2, Metal Gear Solid 3, Silent Hill 2, Silent Hill 3, Jak and Daxter trilogy, Ratchet trilogy, Jak trilogy, Onimusha. You know, they keep going over and over and over with all these sequels on PS2. Whereas a lot of the time on GameCube, Zelda had Wind Waker and Twilight Princess and Four Swords, but Mario just kind of had Sunshine. Donkey Kong had Jungle Beat, but there weren't, I guess you had Donkey Konga. Metroid had Prime 1 and 2.
Prime 1 and 2.
Yeah.
F-Zero just had GX, and we had Pikmin 1 and 2, but...
Kirby didn't really have a game. Like he had
Air Ride.
Air Ride, yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that's sort of the idea here with GameCube, is just it was sort of a one and done for a lot of these games, and we've gotten sequels to them, but there's still something special about those versions. Like we got Mario Power Tennis and Mario Golf, Toadstool Tour, and it's very easy to look at the more recent games in those series and think, I think those were better on GameCube than they are in the modern age, and wish for those instead. We got the introduction of Mario Strikers. We got introduction of Mario Baseball. Very unique titles across all of them, and I think that uniqueness. There was there was a sense of bravery to Nintendo. Like when Nintendo's backed into the corner, they get weird and just start tossing ideas out. And that's where GameCube shines.
Yeah, there's something about that era that I feel like they try to capture again, as with the sports games, as with like even Mario Party, as we see with Mario Party Superstars. There's something about that era, and just back then that they try to capture again with these modern title releases, like with Mario Tennis, the more recent Mario Tennis and Mario Golf games. They don't seem to really have that same full and pull as they did back then. That appeal. I don't know. There's something about it that I feel like personified the GameCube as this, like, I don't know, like this is a console that has a really unique feel to it, and people gravitate towards that a lot. That's why there's so much discussion about it. It's always fascinating to see how there's more discussion about the GameCube than there is with one of the best-selling consoles ever, the PlayStation 2, which is, I mean, which we're touching upon now.
I think because the PS2's net was so broad, is you can't have a driving focus like you can with GameCube. You have this is Nintendo's output, here's Capcom's output, here's whatever's output, or these interesting or weird titles that were made available. But with PlayStation, you have to almost look at individual series. Here's what Ratchet and Clank did, here's what Jak and Daxter did, here's what Grand Theft Auto did, or so forth, all these different RPGs. So it's not really about PlayStation 2 itself, it's about those games. And I think maybe that's why it's not as in the conversation as much. PS2 is just a conduit. GameCube is sort of like a umbrella.
Yeah,
right.
That's true. I think all of us, you can talk to what our favorite games on the PS2 were, and we'll all have different titles that the others never played or probably never even tried before. And then with GameCube, the conversation will always fall to like the same group of games that we're talking about even now, like Mario, Zelda, Fire Emblem, Metroid Prime, like those. Everyone's pretty much, well, most people have played the same kind of games, so we can all kind of have a discussion about it and talk about it together. Whereas PS2 is a little more disassociated that way.
Like, it's not just that we haven't mentioned Suikoden 3 or Wild Hearts or Shadow Heart, Wild Hearts, Wild Arms or Shadow Hearts. But we haven't mentioned Grand Theft Auto, which is, that's what most people probably think of when they think PS2. We haven't, like, there's so many big names we haven't mentioned, and that's just because there's so many that we can't possibly mention them all. Whereas with GameCube, I feel like we've probably, at least just in passing, we've at least said the name of most of the big games in this discussion. Whereas I don't think you can really do that. Like, you can't do that coherently on PS2 without just yapping about a bunch of different franchises.
Yeah.
We haven't mentioned Ape Escape. Ape Escape 3 is fantastic.
Yeah. There's
Burnout. Burnout was a fun series.
Oh yeah. There's I mean, so many RPGs, so many great horror games, so many great adventure games. Like, just as John's been saying, it just covers all those genres. Like, even genres that aren't really catered to anymore. Like, Twisted Metal Black, in my opinion, is the best in the series. Probably the best car combat game ever made.
I do think a big reason for this GameCube focus, it probably is just more people have played most of the big games. Like, it definitely wasn't like a huge success. It was 21 million units, which, it's not crazy far off Wii U. We are talking millions still, but it's not that far off in terms of success. But yet people still talk about GameCube as if it were this massive thing. And I think it mostly is just those who enjoyed it have just stuck with it, and those memories mean a lot to them. And because a lot of them have played Sunshine and Wind Waker and Metroid Prime, they can all sort of come together and talk about it like passionately as if it were a massive thing. Which is that's to be respected. Very few systems can do that. But I think the main reason PS2 doesn't quite have that now is just because most of the audience is so scattered. But they're all amazing systems, though. This was one of the best generations, in my opinion. I think it got to the point where visuals could achieve what they needed to. If you look at a PS2 game now, I don't feel like there's something you could do in that era that you can't really do now. Like, you can still enjoy all these games as if they were brand new. Or most of them. And it's just a fantastic time to look back on, a fantastic time to experience. And whether you were PS2 or GameCube, no one lost. Like, we all had fantastic games to play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Exactly. The only other thing I'll say is that the top selling game on the GameCube was Melee with 7.4 million copies sold. So it didn't even reach, even the top selling game did not reach half the total GameCube owners.
Right.
So it's just in comparison to what Switch has done with its attach rate of certain games.
But still, incredible systems.
Oh, yeah.
Alright everyone, well thank you for watching. If you want to, you can support us over on Patreon, where we do so many cool things.
We do
We give you
things
behind the
sometimes.
scenes look at what we're working on, we can give you early previews to our videos. There's also GVG Cast, where you can submit questions every single week. So consider supporting us. And again, let us know your favourite systems in the comments below. Were you an Xbox guy? And if so, were you disappointed with our lack of Xbox? We love that system, it just doesn't quite hit the same heights as PS2 and GameCube on our end.
And I didn't own one.
Same here.
Well, I enjoyed Xbox, and 360 allowed you to play a bunch of those games too, via backwards compatibility. Not all of them, but a big chunk of them. But yeah, we'll see you guys later. Bye everyone.
Bye.
Till we meet again.